In Indonesia, there's this one word that carries so much weight, a word you'll hear whispered in villages and even in big cities. It sparks this mix of real fear and honestly a little bit of fascination. That word is Santet. For some people, it's just an old myth, but for a whole lot of others, it is a very, very real and dangerous force. So yeah, let's get into it.
So, what are we actually talking about when we say Santet? It's a word that so many people have heard, but when you ask them to pin it down, it gets kind of fuzzy. We're going to break this whole thing down, from its ancient roots all the way to how it's handled in modern law. Okay, so at its absolute core, Santet is basically the act of using some kind of supernatural power to hurt someone from a distance. You can think of it as a form of black magic. And while it's easy for some to just write it off as superstition, the belief in it is so deeply woven into parts of Indonesian culture, and the consequences of that belief, well, they can be terrifyingly real.
All right, here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to dig into its history, then check out all the different regional variations, because there are a few. Then we have to talk about the horrifying 1998 tragedy in Banyuwangi. After that, we'll see how modern law is trying to deal with all this, and we'll wrap up by asking the biggest question of all. Why is this belief still so powerful today? So, to really get a handle on Santet, you can't just look at it now. We have to go way back. This isn't some new thing. Its roots are tangled up in the entire history of the archipelago. Now, here's what's so fascinating. If you go back to the great ancient kingdoms like Majapahit and Sriwijaya, having supernatural abilities wasn't something to be feared. It was actually a respected skill. It was something spiritual elites had, and they used it for stuff like protecting the kingdom or gaining power. But over the centuries, that respect kind of soured into fear. The beliefs never went away, though. They just adapted and are still a huge part of the landscape today, especially when social tensions get high. And you have to understand, the bedrock of all of this is ancient animism. It's this core belief that the world is just full of spirits. They're in rocks, trees, animals, and these spirits can have a direct impact on our lives. It's a worldview that existed long before the major religions arrived, and it still quietly shapes the culture today. Okay, so this whole thing isn't just one size fits all. Santet is not just one practice. Across the thousands of islands in Indonesia, it shows up in all these different ways, with its own local names and, frankly, some pretty terrifying methods. Let's start our tour in West Sumatra. This is Minangkabau country, and it's home to the chilling legend of the Palasik. Now, this is way more than just a simple curse. The Palasik is believed to be a person whose head can literally detach from their body, with organs still attached, and just fly around looking for its prey. And its prey? Infants, and even unborn babies. People believe its presence is what causes those sudden, unexplainable illnesses that can sadly lead to a child's death. It's a fear that has haunted communities for generations. All right, let's jump over to South Sulawesi, where they have their own brand of terror. It's known as the Para Kong. So, the Para King is different. It's a shapeshifter. We're talking about a human who uses black magic to turn into animals, a dog, a snake, you name it, so they can attack people without being seen. The victims suffer from horrible pain, sudden weakness, or even start bleeding for no reason. And these attacks can absolutely be fatal if you don't find a spiritual healer to fight it. Now, over on the huge island of Borneo, in Kalimantan, you'll hear about a powerful curse that's often used like a weapon. It's called nasyang. People usually talk about this one as a tool for revenge. If someone feels like they've been deeply, deeply wronged, they might go to a shaman, a dukun, to send this curse to their enemy. And the effects are fast and they are brutal. We're talking a crazy high fever out of nowhere, vomiting blood, and maybe even paralysis or death. It's a terrifying way that these beliefs get tangled up in settling personal scores. So look, these stories might sound like folklore, right? Campfire tales. But the fear they create is real, and it has had absolutely devastating real-world consequences. We have to turn now to a very, very dark chapter in Indonesia's history, when this belief was turned into a weapon and that fear just exploded into mass violence. 194. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many people were murdered in Banyuwangi, East Java alone during the 1998 massacres. And why? Because they were accused of practicing Santet. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a tidal wave of killings. And this tragedy didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It actually started with an official government order. On February 6, 1998, the local regent told his officials to make a list of anyone suspected of practicing Santet. The idea was to monitor them, but that list basically became a hit list. By that summer, the killings just skyrocketed. And then things got even crazier with the appearance of these mysterious assassins all dressed in black that people started calling ninjas. And when you look at the details, it is just chilling. This was not a spontaneous mob acting out. No, this was an organized campaign of terror. Indonesia's own National Commission on Human Rights calls it a gross human rights violation. People who are targeted had their houses marked with red paint. There were coordinated blackouts to cause chaos. Fake wanted posters were put up to get people angry. And a lot of the victims were killed by hired assassins from out of town. It was systematic, and it was absolutely brutal. So the Banyuwangi tragedy just forces you to ask a huge question. In a modern country, how does your legal system even begin to deal with something as, well, as unprovable as black magic? For decades, it just didn't. But that has finally changed. For years and years, under the old criminal code left over from the Dutch colonial era, the law just ignored the supernatural completely. But the new criminal code, which just came into effect in 2023, made a massive change. There's a new rule, Article 252, and it specifically makes it a crime for someone to profit by claiming they have supernatural powers that they use to hurt people. So how does that actually work? Well, to convict someone, a prosecutor has to prove 3 specific things. First, the person claimed they had supernatural powers. Second, they were offering these spooky services for money. And third, and this is the most important part, their actions led to a real, tangible, provable result: actual suffering, a medically verified illness, or even death. And here's the really clever part. The law isn't putting magic on trial. It completely sidesteps the impossible question of, is Santet real? Because how could you ever prove that in court? Instead, it goes after the real-world crime, the fraud, the money-changing hands, and the very real harm that someone suffers because of it. It's a smart, logical solution to a deeply illogical belief. So that brings us to our final big question. We have modern medicine. We have a new legal system. So why does the belief in Santet not only survive, but actually seem to be thriving in many parts of Indonesia? It pretty much boils down to 2 really powerful things. First, it's just cultural inheritance. These stories and beliefs are passed from parents to children, generation after generation, and they're all connected to that ancient animist worldview we talked about earlier. But the second reason might be even more powerful. Santet gives people an answer when there are no other good answers. You know, for that sudden sickness the doctors can't figure out, or a terrible streak of bad luck that just makes no sense, Santet provides an explanation. It gives you someone or something to blame, and maybe most importantly, it offers the hope of a magical fix. You know, from being a respected skill in ancient kingdoms to being an actual crime in a modern legal book, the story of Santet is kind of the story of Indonesia itself. It's a nation trying to find its way in that messy space between tradition and modernity. And it leaves us with one last thing to think about. When an ancient belief like this goes head-to-head with modern law, what's the right path for a society to take?